Well, as Austin said, my name's Steve Porter, and I'm an enterprise architect at Cost Plus World Market. I attended AstriCon last year looking for companies that were using Asterisk in a small store multi-node configuration. Although I didn't exactly find what I was looking for, I did talk to enough people that were using Asterisk in multi-node configurations to be convinced that it was possible. Over the next 7 months, we planned and rolled Asterisk to all of our retail stores. The rollout was so successful, I decided to present it as a case study this year. In this case study, I'm going to do a quick overview of Cost Plus World Market for those of you that are not familiar with the store. And then I'm going to dive into these agenda topics here. To set the stage, I'll spend a few minutes covering project goals, vendor selection, and system architecture. But the heart of the presentation really is in the remaining topics. I'm going to start high level, and towards the end, I'm going to get deep into scripting. So if you guys are into scripting, we'll cover some of that. Cost Plus World Market is a unique store. One of the many taglines we've used to describe it is 50 countries, one store. We sell things like wine, furniture, baskets, gourmet foods, rugs, candles, and a lot of other products from around the world. We are a US-only retailer with 265 stores in 31 states. Our stores range from 15 to 20,000 square feet, and the equipment needed for the stores varies depending on the size and shape of the store. Typically, it's 3 to 4 phone lines and about 16 phones. The stores are connected with a single MPLS wide area network. We are in control of QoS and have very good SLAs with the vendor, so we typically don't have any issues. As I mentioned before, there's 265 stores, a corporate office in Oakland, California, and 2 distribution centers, one in Stockton, California, and one in Norfolk, Virginia. We needed to replace all of our existing 12-plus-year-old Nortel Option 11 systems. We were experiencing 3 to 4 chassis failures a month. And as you can imagine, that's pretty disruptive to our stores. We knew the next PBX had to be VoIP capable, and we wanted to implement extension-to-extension dialing across the organization, as well as reduce the maintenance required to support such an infrastructure. The PBX in the stores also had to function during a WAN outage, so it had to have individual survivability. And we also had a strong desire to replace the existing Wi-Fi, which was a proprietary symbol Wi-Fi, with an industry standard 802.11 Wi-Fi. Every organization uses their phones differently. For us, these are the features that were most important. In-store paging over the PA system. Our stores kind of live and die with that. Call, park, and pickup, another feature that's really important because when you've got one person on the register and one person on the floor, the register person pretty much answers the phone, pages what they need, parks the call, and gets back to what they're doing. We needed support for SIP and analog trunks. Push-to-talk was a new feature, but everyone really wanted it. Finally, we needed the ability to integrate with Microsoft Link. And although it's not so germane to this conversation, we wanted the wireless phones to double, not just as phones, but as an application platform so we could automate things that the associates did on a normal basis, like product lookup, price lookup, finding inventory in other stores, and then being able to immediately call those stores to put product on hold for customers. We looked at many vendors, but the choice really came down to 4 players, and after deeper analysis, only 2, Cisco and Asterisk. Cisco had a great enterprise platform, but individual store survivability required coordinated changes between the UC, which is managed by the phone people in our corporation, and configuration on the router at the store, which is managed by our network team. We knew long-term that that disconnect was going to cause problems and that wouldn't be reliable. ShoreTel had an amazingly simple platform as well, but it became complex real fast when we started talking about upgrading firmwares on PBX and phones across 260-plus locations. We deployed Microsoft Link in our corporate office to meet the survivability goals in the stores we would have had to put a server into each store, and that was not cost effective. Asterisk, on the other hand, provided everything we needed for the store. As a quick side note, in testing all of these and Avaya, we were actually able to integrate Asterisk into each one of these solutions and use it as kind of a test bed for driving load balancing. So Asterisk is extremely flexible. The feature set of Asterisk met all of our must-haves and most of our want-haves. And the programmability of it actually allowed us to, with just a few macros, reach all of our wanteds. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about management. Asterisk made it real easy to manage the system. You'll see that as we go through this presentation. And from a price maintenance perspective, let's just say it's a lot less. As you guys can imagine, we purchased support for our Zorcom stuff, and as you can imagine, with licensing in Cisco or Microsoft or Avaya or all these, it's just a lot less. I want to spend a few minutes talking about why we chose Zorcom. First of all, they gave us command line access and root access at the command line, and that was really important because we needed additional services to work with our Polycom phones. We wanted to have TFTP and SMB support so that we could easily move files in between our corporate office and the PBXs. As a bonus, Zorcom doesn't charge for SIP trunk or user-based licensing. That made the paperwork and the management of maintenance so much easier. They also have a rapid recovery utility, which I'll cover later in more detail. But it allowed us to prepare a PBX for a store in only 15 minutes. Doing 265 of these, it was very important that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on each store. Zorcom also has great product support. We talked to a few customers, and they made claims that many of their calls were answered on the very first call. And I'm happy to say we found the same was true in our experience. Finally, their GUI brought together the best of free PBX and Elastics. And I was able to allow the telecom team to not only manage the telephony functions, but also some of the networking stuff as well. We chose Polycom SpectraLink phones. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but I did want to focus on that one item in the middle that's bolded, and that's configuration management, because it's another area that really allowed us to blow the phones out very quickly and get the job done fast. And when you buy phones, you've got to consider that they're on the books probably a 3 to 5 year purchase. Many of us know that our phones will probably stay on the desk for more like 10 years. But you can't be penny wise and pound foolish in selecting a phone. You've got to consider the initial setup and deployment cost. If you're going to have a phone for 10 years, you're definitely going to do a firmware upgrade, and then just the basic move adds and changes. At a minimum, the phone should provide a scriptable process to set up the configuration and upgrade the firmware. The Polycom SpectraLink phones are completely config file driven, as are a lot of the other phones. Every aspect of the phone was controlled with these config files. So once we figured out the right way to lay out the configuration settings in a hierarchy, it made deploying these real easy. And again, I'll cover that a little later. Web-based utilities for configuration are great. They're very simple. But when you have to do it 4,000 times, it gets really time-consuming. So let's dive into what's in each store. We have a Zorcom XR1000, a manager phone, two to four back office phones, one for each register, and we have 4 SpectraLink wireless phones with the 1D and 2DR scanners. We also have a Snome PA1 for paging. All this equipment was tied to Cisco PoE switches in the back room, so everything was powered by PoE. From a dial plan perspective, we wanted to make it easy for the stores to call within the store, and yet also make it easy for them to understand how to call for the same functions in other stores as well. So we came up with a dial plan that included the first 3 digits were the store number, and the last 2 digits were the unique extension within the store. And we made those extensions consistent across all the stores. For instance, if you dialed 10 in a store, you always get the manager phone. 14, receiving dock, 21, register 1, etc. If you needed to get the same kind of services in a different store, you would simply dial the 3-digit store number in front of it and dial, for instance, the manager at store 224, you dial 22410. This was something we threw in a little later, dialing the store number and a 99 to ring each, that actually rings all of the phones at store 325. We did this because of speed dials, and I'll cover that again a little later in the presentation. But what this created was a feeling for the end user that they weren't just using an individual phone system. They were using a massive network of a phone system, even though it was configured a PBX at a time. In order to pull this off, we had to have connections in between each of the PBXs. We decided to use EEX because it's firewall friendly. My network guys loved it. And it was pretty easy to configure. Again, we'll dive into that a little later. This screenshot here is a management screen out of free PBX that just tells you how many EEX connections you have online. And every switch shows the same thing. Every switch is connected to 267 other switches. By the way, there is almost no CPU drain with this going on. I mean, the initial fire up takes a little bit, but once it's in place, it's very low CPU utilization. Looking to the future, next year, we're going to integrate 4-digit dialing so that stores can directly access our corporate office and our 2 distribution centers. All right, let's talk about the speed dial numbers. With the Nortel system, they had a dedicated speed dial number button on the actual phone. Instead of trying to replicate that with some function button, we simply told them, instead of hitting that button, you're going to hit a 2 and then do the same thing you did before, which was enter the 3-digit speed dial number. Speed dial numbers were used primarily to call other stores, but also used to access things like credit authorization, because it's a different number for American Express, for Visa, for all the different carriers. As well as they did speed dial numbers to get to the distribution centers and certain departments within the corporate office. We enhanced the speed dial functionality with a little dial plan logic underneath. When they dialed the speed dial number, the first thing it would do is it would attempt an EEX connection directly over the network to the other store. If for some reason that failed, it would then attempt a DOTI connection out the local analog lines connected to the phone switch. If that failed, it would make an EEX connection to a box we have dedicated back at the corporate office for just providing dial tone to stores in this very for this very reason. And it would actually grab a DOTI line and dial out from the corporate office. The best thing about this is there's a lot of complex logic here, and the store didn't have to care about it. They just picked up the phone and dialed the 4-digit number for their speed dial. It was all handled underneath. And it would seamlessly handle WAN outages or local line failures without the store even knowing it. So if you zoom back up and look at the whole network, you got 265 stores with approximately 16 extensions, a little over 42,000 phones, 850 analog phone lines, and 1,500 Cisco access points, all controlled with a primary controller at our corporate office and a secondary in our Stockton DR center. I want to spend a few minutes covering the key aspects that made this deployment successful. And as I mentioned before, one of the main things was having access to the command line so that we could script things and make maintenance very simple. We had to add a few services. The first we added was a TFTP service. This was used by our Polycom phones for 2 things. 1, when they boot, they had to load their configuration files. And 2, they would check a directory to see if there was a newer firmware level And if it was, it would automatically start an upgrade process. That was pretty important because if I was using a hosted model and I didn't have a PBX on site, it would try and pull the firmware upgrades over the WAN connection every single time. This allowed us to push the firmware upgrades to a central location within each store and then have the stores grab it off of that. We also set up cron tab jobs that used SMB support to pull configuration file changes off of a file server in our corporate office. I'm gonna cover these cron tab jobs in detail a little later on in the presentation. Anything times 265 is a lot of work. The automation was key to reduce the project labor. And a nice byproduct of that was it produced a really consistent product. I'm going to dive, again, a little deeper into this. The first thing we did was we automated the build process. The Rapid Recovery tool is a utility that provides an easy way to backup and restore the PBX. We built a gold image first that had recorded messages, the IVR setup, call queues, and ring groups. Pretty much everything but the individual extensions for the stores. We used this Rapid Recovery tool to restore that image onto a PBX. We would take the number of phones that we needed to send to a store, and we'd lay them out on a table, and we'd scan them with an RF barcode scanner. We'd scan the MAC addresses off of them and assign extensions to them. And that did two things. One, it built an extensions import file that we could import with the free PBX bulk extensions import. And two, it actually built the Polycom configuration files that we simply copied onto the PBX that when they were loaded, it would send the extensions out to the phones after they upgraded. So once we burned the image, we imported the extensions. We copy and pasted the extensions into the ring groups because all the phones had to ring when the inbound call ring group grabbed it. We would copy any custom sound prompts, directions, hours, welcome to the Atlanta Cosmos World Market, that kind of stuff. We change the system name and IP, pack and ship it to a store. It was only when it got to the store and got installed and set up that the phones were actually taken out of the cellophane, assembled, hooked to the network, and the first thing they do is they grab the newest firmware off the PBX, boot, upgrade, grab the config, and come up. It was a real time saver in packaging the stores. So a lot of that stuff could happen in the field, so we didn't have to unbox, upgrade, rebox, and ship. The nightly cron tab scripts updated general messages. Normally you'll hear a welcome message that is consistent when you call our stores, and then you'll hear about our specials. That special message changes probably every 2 to 4 weeks in our stores. And now we can easily push it out to all stores, where before, our stores used to have to individually record it in every single store. And we had a huge issue with compliance. Stores would not record their own messages, and so old messages would stay there for weeks. This completely solved that problem. We can update speed dial numbers pretty fast. And lastly, the EECS partners. This next slide I hesitated to put into the presentation, but I just wanted to show you just how powerful the command line is in giving you access to the MySQL database that holds the key pairs that FreePBX uses to generate the configuration files. When we first rolled out our call park configuration, we didn't think ahead to think that when a call comes into a store and gets parked and then roll expires out of the park and then rings all the phones again, that the employees would need to know that that was an expired call and they should answer it a little differently. FreePBX actually gives you a parameter here called caller ID prepend, which allows you to put something in the front of it to say, hey, this just expired out of a call park. You need to answer it a little differently. So to fix that, after we had rolled this to all the stores, we went into MySQL And we ran a command line MySQL update statement that actually changed this part color ID pair and put this data value in it. Once that's done, we called this module and passed it the reload parameter. And that's really the same thing as clicking the apply button. You know, when you got the little orange apply button at the top of free PBX, and it goes through and it regenerates any scripts that were needed. The nice thing about this is that we were able to make a change that was then reflected within the GUI. So if someone else wanted to change it on an individual basis down the road, we didn't do it somewhere in a config file that wasn't seen in the GUI. This is very powerful, but it's also very dangerous. So my recommendation, if you're going to try something like this, test, 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 and even then roll it out in small chunks to make sure that you're not going to wipe your entire, create a problem across your entire chain. Survivability was key as well. I think I covered this before, but paging and push-to-talk is very important to our stores. So we had to have an individual PBX. We really couldn't do a hosted model. And hosted models are great. I've talked to several people that hosted works fine for. In retail, though, I've just found that it really doesn't work. Let's talk about some of the pitfalls we hit. We actually rolled this out in two stages. We piloted 20 stores over our peak season. And we learned real quick that we needed to go through a design, a pilot, and evaluation stage and really spend the time up front to perfect the build and maintenance process. Those first 20 stores were extremely painful to install because we didn't automate it. And we actually spent the time after that to go back to the lab and make a list of everything that you might have to maintain in the field and then find ways to automate it. We were doing 1 or 2 stores a week in the first 20. After we automated things, we were doing 30 stores a week. It made a huge difference. If you have an older PBX, 12, 15 years old, it was probably installed with ground start lines to prevent something called glare or call collision. Ground start lines are really not supported by too many gateways these days. There's only a couple on the market, and we tried them all. It worked in some locations, but in most locations we had minor buzzes and hums that really got in the way of voice quality and sometimes even tone recognition. My advice is, first of all, go SIP if you can. If you can go SIP, do it. If you have to stick with analog lines, do not try a ground start to loop start device. They sell them out there for about $200. They don't really work all that well. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I would, as hard as it might be, I would plan for a coordinated line change on the night of the install. We ended up doing that for about the last 70 stores we did, and it worked out much better than trying to deal with the ground start trunks. So avoid those at all costs. The final pitfall I'll cover is probably the most difficult to achieve. The KISS principle definitely applies when you're trying to deploy a multi-node or a massive multi-node deployment. Balancing simplicity and power is always a challenge. Once you have the requirements and the design, focus on system architecture, dial plan, and configuration management, and try and simplify things as much as you can. Really study and practice them. Again, that slide where, evaluate, design, pilot. All right, let's dive into some of the scripting. How am I doing time-wise? Wow, I'm a little behind. All right, so scripting. Let's start with the speed dial script. We kind of talked through the logic of it. As I mentioned before, the stores use those speed dial numbers to primarily call external services and to reach other stores quickly. Speed dial numbers are stored in a configuration file that is pulled nightly by the cron tab scripts. As part of the gold image, we added a pound include line in the extensions _ custom conf, which those of you that don't know, that's a standard file given to you by FreePBX to put your own stuff into. The speed dial comp file contains one entry for each speed dial number and a speed dial macro. The speed dial macro takes two parameters. The first is a phone number dial string. The second is an EEX dial string. The EEX dial string is optional. If you were putting a macro in to call like credit auth, you wouldn't put an EEX dial string because that just didn't make sense. This kind of walks you through the logic. If the EEX exists, it's going to attempt it. And through testing, we found it's going to come back with one of two things. Either it'll work, or it'll come back with congested, or channel unavailable. If it comes back with either of those, it rolls over to the next test, which is dialing out via the local trunk. Again, the same test happens, and if that fails, then it would attempt the dial string, but it would pass it to our dial tone server in the corporate office. The speed dial entries look like this here. Starts with the speed dial number, and then we pass it the phone number here, and then the EEX string here. Notice here's this store number and the 99. Idea behind that is that when they hit the speed dial, it's going to bypass all the IVR crap and just ring all of the phones in the store, so they don't have to listen to the general greeting. Of course, if it fails the EEX and dials through the local number, they do have to hear that, unfortunately. I mentioned before that for EEX, every store is connected to every other store. It would be a really tedious task to add another store manually to all the other stores when it comes online. We use two files to simplify this process. The first file contains routing entries so that when it matches a 5-digit number with the store, it'll simply dial the EEX string. It'll pass that call off to that store, and then your traditional hang-up here. So there's one entry for every store, or there's two entries, I guess, in this file for every store. And the way we set it up was we just created a file that had every entry for every store. We pushed it down to every store. But we used the sed script to remove the entry for the local store. We looked up this, we found the store number by looking at the PBX name, which was store pbx.cpwm.com. And then we would look for entries that started with that, and we would remove them from the file. And that actually prevented looping within, because if you had a routing entry for your own extensions within the store, it was going to loop constantly. The last thing we did was we had an entry, these two entries in here, but these entries were store, just SSS here on these two. And again, we looked up the store number and we replaced the SSS with the actual store number. This takes anything that it receives from another store as 371, its local store. It's going to pass to 609, which is the local ring group number. That's how we get the speed dial numbers to actually ring all the stores within, all the phones within the store. The second file is pretty simple. It's actually the IEX_custom.com file. Again, a file that is given to you by FreePBX to put your own custom EEX entries into. And we just created one per store, and we just had a standard setup for each one. So upon boot, it's going to load all these up. It's going to create connections from one store to all the other stores. This one file gets copied to all other systems, and they all know how to talk to each other based on just this one file. So now adding a store to the PBX network is incredibly easy. You first of all deploy the PBX. You add an EEX partner configuration entry to the EEX file. You add an EEX routing configuration entry to the EEX routing file. And you add your new speed dial entry. Overnight, and it just comes up on the network. It's just one more store that every other store talks to. The speed dial numbers automatically work. The direct dial numbers automatically work. And it's just that easy. This is a few things we have lined up for next year. Although we decided for ease, we were going to keep our POTS lines within the store. We are going to go to line pulling. As you saw, we had 850 lines across all the stores. We believe we can cut that in half if we line pull them. We will leave at least one line in every store for emergency and 911 dialing. We're also going to integrate it to Microsoft Link, which is our corporate office phone system. And we're trying to launch an all-store conference bridge. We do about 5 of these a year, and right now we use an external service. It hosts about 300 people. We'd really like to have a conference bridge in our corporate office. Since it's our own network, all of it would be network-driven. We figured out it would take about 4% of our bandwidth to actually pull this off. We just need to get a conference server that handles the calls in the way we want it handled. So that's also on the 2014 docket. And that's my presentation. As I said at the start, last year I came to AsteriskCon looking for proof that Asterisk was strong enough and reliable enough to. I hope this presentation demonstrates this proof and provides some guidance on a deployment strategy. Thank you.
Great.
Allison,
yeah,
do we have
some time for questions. Absolutely. Anybody have any questions for Stephen? Yes.
What kind of data connections do you have if you have the EECS connection? I know it's not a lot of overhead, he said, but what kind of, like, is it internet, VPN, or what kind of connections do they have to do the EECS? So all the stores are connected with, it used to be a 768 MPLS connection, and we're actually upgrading it this year to 1.5 meg. And that's really not because of the phone system. It's driven by our need to provide internet access to the stores. So they have internet through the corporate office? Yes. And MPLS gives you a low latency internet to the voice? Very, yeah. Yeah, I think our worst store is about 68 milliseconds. Huh? Good question.
Great, yeah. And yet, what's it? There we go. Mr. Smith?
Thank you. I noticed you use a different EECS context, or a different context for each store connection. Why did you do that?
That's a great question. We started doing that because of some issues we were having with looping. And what we found out was that that wasn't really the cause of the looping, but we didn't go back and change it. So it's there. The short answer is there's really no good reason, and you really don't need to do that.
Excellent. Good question. Anybody else? Yes.
Why'd you decide to go with the wireless handhelds instead of the decked phones?
That was mostly because we wanted to be able to host applications on them. We wrote an application and actually did about a 2-minute video for the application and pushed it out to the stores. This application would allow them to scan a product, hit a location button, and see what their inventory is and what the inventory is in the closest 7 stores. From that point, they could hit a button and it would call the closest store or one of the stores instantly on the phone, and they could put that product on hold for the customer. They could also look at that store's information to show the customer and even pull up a Google map on the phone to show them how to get to the store. And we wanted that kind of functionality so that the store associate didn't have to carry both a phone and like a mobile computer or an RF gun. So that was really the driving factor behind. And that caused us to have to put in a full Wi-Fi setup, but we figured with the upcoming bring your own device demands and associate mobile demands, we were going to use it anyways. So that's why we went that direction.
Excellent.
Good question, though. I mean, we really did take a hard look at DECT, and it was a consideration.
Yeah, great. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen.
All right, thank you.
It was awesome.